if you inputted prepaid electricity since yesterday and you are an Eskom customer, you would have found out that you have gotten less units for your money. Why? Because from the 1st of April, the 2025-2026 price increases came into effect, 12.74% for Eskom customers. But some customers will pay much more, some less, and a few will even see deductions, because Eskom now says you no longer pay for the amount of electricity you use, but have now broken up, segmented their customer base in 3 tariff categories: home light for low-income households, home power for middle to high-income households, and home flex for wealthier customers. Chris Yelland, energy analyst, really appreciate your time. Chris, the 12.74% increase aside, is there any benefit to any Eskom customer if you're finding yourself in these new segmented tariff categories: home light, home power, and home flex?
Yes, Lester, there is definitely some benefits, and the benefits mainly are to the wealthier and larger customers, and the downside or negative or higher prices apply to smaller or poorer households. So yes, the rich seem to benefit and the poor seem to pay more.
How is that supposed to be a caring state-owned enterprises, which is the most vulnerable, paying more for electricity?
Yeah, look, the argument by Eskom is that smaller households have been heavily subsidized in the past. Smaller and poorer households have been heavily subsidized in the past by the more wealthier, and that they have done a major restructuring of the tariffs. So the tariff structure has changed, and the impact of this change is to reduce the cross-subsidization between larger and wealthier customers to smaller, poorer customers. So in this particular round of price increases, the poorer tend to see greater increases than the wealthier in terms of the rands that they're paying per month. The increase, the percentage increase, is less for larger, wealthier customers than for poorer, smaller customers.
How are these categories determined? Is it by property price? Of course, if you're renting, you may earn a lower income, but the landlord in which you're renting from could have a high-value property.
No, not in the case of Eskom. What you're talking about is what the city of Cape Town is doing, which, if you want my personal view, is a much more pragmatic and sensible way of approaching the whole matter of tariffs. Because the value of one's property is an indicator of the of the ability of a customer to afford electricity, and therefore the tariffs that they could be on. And the interesting thing about it is that there is an existing register of property owners and their property rates, which will are determined also by the property value. So it's quite a useful way of doing it, a clever way of doing it, I think. Contrast that with the city of Johannesburg. Their approach to putting people on what they call a lifeline tariff, or tariff aimed at the very poor, is that you have to be on what is known as an indigent register. Now, to get on an indigent register, which is a completely separate register to the property evaluation, is a very complicated and difficult and bureaucratic process that has to be repeated every 6 months. And it makes it almost impossible for people to get onto this register, and therefore very few people receive the benefits of the lifeline tariffs.
Yeah.
But in the case, by the way, in the case of Eskom, no, it's not determined by property value. It's really determined by the size of your connection, whether it's a 20 amp connection, a 60 amp connection, or an 80 amp connection, or a single phase connection, or a 3-phase connection. So it's really to do with the capacity of the connection. It depends on the rate that the tariff that you go on.
Very quick question from a listener, Chris. I had the listener says, I have a question about the solar levies. It might be, would it be a constitutional violation? This listener asked. Eskom has clarified, saying these levies could only come into effect from 2026. But this listener says that the state cannot pass the cost of its failure onto the very citizens who are trying to survive responsibly, even those who can afford solar panels.
Yeah, look, it's a very it's a complex and a contested area and discussion. Eskom would argue differently and would argue that it is necessary. The bottom line is this, that there are a whole lot of requirements, what we call compliance requirements, if you're going to go onto a home solar PV and battery energy storage system at your residence. And Eskom, which is also again different from City of Cape Town and other municipalities, requires that anybody who goes on to, has a solar PV system connected to the Eskom network must be on what is called the home power tariff. Now, the home power tariff, if you look at the costs involved in the structure of the tariff, is really aimed at wealthier customers. And therefore, I would argue that, the requirement that you have to be on this tariff if you have a solar PV system is anti-poor, because there are middle class and, lower income households that do want to put on solar PV and battery storage, and solar should not be simply for the wealthy. Yeah. It should be an option for everybody, and to make the structure and the tariff and the cost involved so high as to make it only really accessible to wealthy customers is in my view anti-poor, but Eskom would argue strenuously differently, but my view.
Chris Yelland, LNG expert, really appreciate your time.